Hey guys, welcome back. And this week, I'm gonna take it easy a little bit. No cute themes, no diatribes on bad games, not even any Disney games this time. No, instead, these are just a few random games that I don't really have any place for, besides the fact that I just really like them, and they're always sitting at the top of my favorite games on the Super NES. Also, none of these games seems to really get covered too much, so that's reason enough to stick these in a video. And speaking of that video, let's get it started with an incredible story-driven mech game that seems to constantly get overlooked somehow. Cybernator for the Super NES was like nothing I had played up to that point. I was pretty new to the whole mech thing in the early 90s, and the idea of piloting a giant mech suit around and blowing stuff up was instantly appealing to me. But what I thought was just going to be a basic action game like Contra or something like that quickly turned into a game that had a lot more to it. But before we get to all that story stuff, you need to know how to play it, and the best way that I can describe the action in Cybernator is just heavy. Everything feels like it has tons of weight behind it, and rightfully so since you're piloting a massive mech suit that weighs hundreds of tons. Of course it should feel heavy. Even just falling from short distances, you can see your mech's armor plates sagging under the weight of the landing. And when you jump, it just kind of looks like someone's launched a semi-truck into the air and they're just hoping for the best when it lands. I love these little animation touches that conveys just how heavy your mech is. And while the action is definitely slower due to being in a mech suit, that's not really a bad thing. It just means you gotta play it a little bit different than your typical action game. Your mech suit is surprisingly versatile though. You start off with a basic Vulcan cannon, but as you play you'll pick up new weapons like missiles that are great for bosses, and a laser beam that can cut through multiple enemies at once. You can make each weapon stronger by collecting power-ups as you go, with each weapon getting a more powerful version of itself once it's fully leveled up. But there is a catch, since you can only upgrade the weapon that you have equipped, so choose wisely. Each level has you undertaking an assigned mission, though most just boils down to you making it to the end of a particular stage and then defeating a boss. Some, however, actually have multiple ways to beat a stage, like the end of this one where you can either defeat a boss that's trying to kill you or destroy the massive boosters on the space station hurtling it to Earth. And depending on what you do in stages like this will determine what ending to the story you get, and that's definitely something you didn't see too much back then. Speaking of the story, this is something you're gonna either love or hate about Cybernator. Because make no mistake about it, this game wants to tell you a story. A dense, detailed, dramatic mech war story complete with political intrigue, plot twists, and lots of characters. And it's gonna tell you that story whether you like it or not. Dialogue boxes will pop up mid-action and go on for minutes sometimes, so if you just want to blow stuff up, this is going to get old really fast for you. The crazy thing is that the Japanese release of this game had even more plot since Konami toned it down for us Western audiences. That being said though, if you do like a good anime mech drama, then really this isn't too bad of a story at all, if you can just keep track of it. Cybernator stuck with me because it just felt so different from anything else on the Super NES. The heavy, grounded mech combat with story-driven gameplay, it was like an interactive anime for me, and I was really into anime at the time. And if you're thinking, wait, doesn't this game kind of sound familiar if it's part of something else? Well, yeah, it is, you're right. In Japan, it's known as Assault Suits, part of a franchise that continued all the way to the Saturn and PlayStation, with re-releases happening all the way up till, well, now. And I think that's how you should check it out these days thanks to Assault Suits Vulcan Declassified on the Nintendo Switch. This is actually the original version of Cybernator, just with an all-new English translation plus all the cut content that was missing from the Super NES version. So if you're curious, then check that one out on the eShop. But really, no matter which way you end up playing this one, I think you're gonna have a good time, especially if you like story-based mech games. So strap your butt in your favorite giant mech and experience for yourself the one-of-a-kind sci-fi action and drama that Cybernator is famous for. King of Dragons for the Super NES was one of those go-to beat-em-ups that offered a lot more than what you'd think. Now, don't think that you can make it through one of my videos without getting at least one beat-em-up mentioned, but hear me out, because I think King of Dragons is one of the most unique on the system. The combination of solid gameplay and a bunch of RPG stuff that was never seen in games like this back then makes King of Dragons a sleeper contender for best beat-em-up on the Super NES. As soon as that title screen hits, you know that this is going for the most generic RPG fantasy vibe that you can possibly achieve on the Super NES. And the selection of characters confirms that, with a bunch of very familiar RPG archetypes for you to choose from. And unlike a lot of games like this, the characters you choose are very different from one another. I mean, you got your typical damage classes like the warrior and cleric that excel in hacking and slashing your way through things, but you've also got classes like the archer and mage that specialize in long-range attacks. And they're not just damage classes disguised with a robe and a bow, since they actually play differently than the guys that like to cave heads in with heavy weapons. But what's even more interesting is that each character can level up both their power and gear just like a RPG. Leveling up really only seems to raise your health bar a bit, but that does help with how much magic your character can use, since this is unfortunately one of those games where your special attack also uses health points. But leveling up mitigates that a bit, letting you use your magic more liberally, or just take a few more hits from some of the more annoying bosses. The gear level ups are a bit more interesting, since they'll usually drop out of chests laying around or at the end of the level. This new gear will actually change your appearance a bit and also do more damage to the enemies than your previous gear did, which gives the player a nice visual cue that they're actually getting stronger, and it does work pretty well. Of course, you're pretty much guaranteed to max your character out by the end of the game, so it's not a deeply strategic RPG experience, but the fun comes from experimenting with different classes and seeing how they evolve. And of course, it's even better if you got a buddy around, since teaming up and trying out different class combinations is one of the best things about the game. But for as basic as its leveling systems are, I think King of Dragons really excels at feeling like you're getting stronger and stronger. The constant new gear and leveling your character up gives you way more of a sense of progression thanks to being able to see and feel your character getting stronger. That's why a lot of brawlers get boring within a level or two, and unless you're a crazy person like I am and enjoy the monotony of that stuff, then King of Dragons may be for you. Capcom would eventually refine these ideas in their Dungeons & Dragons arcade games, which are widely considered some of the best beat-em-ups ever made. Tower of Doom and Shadows over Mysteria took everything King of Dragons did and pushed it further, turning them almost into full-fledged RPGs rather than just mindless brawlers. But if you want a taste of where those games got their start, then King of Dragons on the Super NES is still a lot of fun. It's a quick and fun playthrough, especially if you got a friend around. And besides maybe Turtles in Time, I think King of Dragons is the beat-em-up that has aged the best on this system. And I think this is one quest that you definitely shouldn't pass up on. Rock and Roll Racing for the Super NES is a game that I never expected to like. Now, I think I've mentioned this before that I was just not the biggest racing game fan back around when the Super NES was out. So when I saw Rock and Roll Racing sitting there with a hot pink cover yelling about music by bands that were all at least 20 years old at the time, I wasn't really jumping to play it. But for whatever reason, possibly because my dad was yelling at me to hurry up and find a game to rent, I took a chance on it, and I was not prepared for just how much fun I ended up having with this game. As soon as you turn this one on, you realize it's not going to be your standard racing game, as the most Super NES sounding rendition of Bad to the Bone that you've ever heard starts blaring at you. Now, licensed music in video games was pretty rare back then, but Rock and Roll Racing lived up to its name with tracks by Steppenwolf, Judas Priest, and others, none of which that I had any idea who they were, but my dad did assure me that they were a big deal at one point. Once you're done jamming out to the menu music, you're then pushed straight into selecting your driver from some of the homeliest looking aliens that I've ever seen, and then selecting your vehicle to race in. Each one has their own stats, weapons, and upgrades to go along with it, with the most important thing being that you can paint it whatever color you want. After you've made the prettiest alien hobo car imaginable, it's time to get out onto the track. And that's where Rock and Roll Racing's gameplay is arcade racing at its finest. All you need to do is jam on the gas, slide around corners, blow people up with weapons, and pray that no one does it better than you by the time the checkered flag waves. It sounds simple, but what sets this one apart is the physics. Every vehicle handles differently. And just as you start getting the hang of not slamming into every corner of the track with your current vehicle, the game throws a new one at you. Of course, upgrading your car does help some with faster engines, better armor, improved tires, and all that stuff, but even maxed out, you're still at the mercy of the track and the ridiculous AI. Thankfully, you can dish out just as much punishment as you take with forward-firing projectiles, rear-mounted weapons, and turbo boosts that usually just send you flying into walls or off the track entirely. At first, you can only use all this stuff once per lap, but upgrading is essential since winning most races won't be how well you stick to that sweet racing line. Instead, it's all about making sure everyone in front of you explodes faster than you do. And the sooner they do, the better your chances are at not coming in last. You also get various pickups on the track itself, like health and money, along with totally bogus stuff like mines and slime puddles that slow you down. But if you can keep your wits about you and manage your weapons well enough while having a little bit of luck on your side, then you shouldn't have too many problems getting first in most of the races. Most Super NES racing games back then leaned toward realism for whatever reason. Like, I'm pretty sure 80% of the racing games back then were some sort of Formula One game. At least that's what it seemed like to me.
It's just like the real thing.
I wanted arcade racing, stuff like Mario Kart and Top Gear, but for whatever reason, those games were kinda in short supply. So something like Rock and Roll Racing was exactly what I needed. The super fast and chaotic gameplay was right up my alley. And the two-player co-op sealed the deal. I remember renting this one multiple times just because it was one of the rare games that my dad seemed to actually really like playing with me. Now, if I had to pick my favorite Super NES racing game, it's probably Rock and Roll Racing. Mario Kart and Top Gear are classics, but for the sheer fun and nostalgia, Rock and Roll Racing wins. And thanks to Blizzard's arcade collection on the PC, it's still easy to play today. If you've never tried it, then I think it's absolutely worth the money. But regardless of where you play it, this is one racing game that, thankfully, never stopped rocking.
Nick scores a first-place knockout. Viper finishes second. Rip is a weak third. Shred is in another time zone.
Super Adventure Island for the Super NES is about as simple as video games get, but that's something that I can actually appreciate at times. Super Adventure Island hit stores fairly soon after the Super NES was first released, and I can remember this one being one of the few games that was sitting on my video store shelves for it, and I was rabid for anything Super NES at the time, so you better believe I picked this one up even though I had never even played an Adventure Island game before. And what I ended up with was a no-frills arcade platformer wrapped in some incredible graphics and sound. Now, I don't think I need to spend too much time explaining the gameplay because Super Adventure Island keeps it about as basic as you can get, maybe too basic depending on who you ask. But all you really need to know how to do is run and jump your way through each stage, avoiding enemies along the way since this is one of those games where you can only take one hit and then you gotta start over. There is a sort of time limit in place with a bar at the top of the screen that slowly ticks down the more you move, with the only way to refill it by grabbing the various fruit that's littered around each stage. But really, there's so much fruit in these stages that it rarely comes into play up until the end of the game. And really, that's pretty much it. You do get a couple of weapons to chuck at enemies every now and again, and you also get to find a skateboard to ride, because nothing says early 90s radical like a caveman on a skateboard. But you know what? Even with how simple it is, I still had fun with it. Normally, I'm not big on games that demand you to memorize every little thing just to avoid cheap one-hit deaths. And yeah, you will run out of continues, but getting back to where you were is quick enough that it really never feels too frustrating. Of course, the real standout here isn't the gameplay, it's the presentation. Now, coming from the NES, Super Adventure Island looked really good, with bright, colorful stages and big, detailed sprites. The graphics admittedly did start to lose a lot of their luster as even better looking games kept coming out for the system, but at the time this was a great looking game. But the soundtrack is what really stuck with me. Even now, this holds up really well. This was one of those games that made me realize just how good video game music could be, thanks in no small part to the legendary Yutsuo Koshiro being the composer. This is the same guy behind Streets of Rage 2's incredible soundtrack. And a lot of that game's musical DNA is here as well, just with a more laid-back hip-hop vibe. Here, you guys listen to it for a minute and tell me what you think. But for all of its strengths, Super Adventure Island got a bit of a cold reception when it was launched. People weren't thrilled that it felt like a step back from Adventure Island 3 on the NES, which had an explorable map, rideable dinosaurs, and even items to use. That game was basically Super Mario 3 in Adventure Island form. So to go from that to a game that stripped things back to basics, well, you can see why some folks weren't very happy. But for a kid like me renting the game for a weekend and just looking for some quick fun and action, Super Adventure Island absolutely delivered. As mentioned earlier, I missed out on the NES Adventure Island games at the time, so this was my first experience with the series. And honestly, it made me go back and check out the earlier games on the NES. And I'd bet that I wasn't the only one that did that. But if you were one of those people that missed out on the first Adventure Island game on the Super NES, then try it out. It's simple arcade fun, plus the music is so good that it deserves a recommendation on that alone. And I think that's gonna do it for this week. I know this is a random as all hell list of games, but did any of these games register with any of you? When I make videos like this, I kinda get caught up in trying to put together overarching themes or just trying to tell a good story. But sometimes I just want to toss all of that out and talk about some of the games that I really like. Stuff that doesn't get much attention from the community because they don't drive those all-important YouTube metrics up. And I don't think any of these games are gonna send my numbers through the roof. So that's why I need all of you to click on that like button to help get this video out to even more people. And for everyone that watches these videos all the way to the end, I can't thank you enough for the support that you do give. But I think that's gonna do it for me this week. So check back next week for maybe a bit more of a cohesive list of games to talk about. But until then, thanks for watching.